So again, my name is Jennifer. This is my website. I also have a YouTube where I do post some things so that people can stay on top of the information if they're interested in it. Last week we talked about relationships. Most everything centers around relationships because that's what people are often here to resolve. But everything ties together. So everything that we talk about is going to be relevant in your life in some capacity. Okay? So last week, because some people missed, I'll recap what we talked about just in general as an overview. So I've mentioned before, I used to be a history and language arts teacher. So I pull from those things in terms of psychology. So history, anthropology, sociology, all feed psychology. Because of our history, which has been very controlled, so to speak, we are not in a good place psychologically, clearly. Would anybody disagree with that? Like as a nation, we're not in a good place psychologically. Most people are depressed, anxious, have PTSD, have bipolar, have all these things. They're all rooted in one thing. I have a drawing. Every disorder or disease, I might as well just put disorder or disease, which is just a label, is all rooted in trauma. So our society is fragmented. We've talked about that healing process. You know, you're born, you fragment. At about birth to age 7, you become your ego and your authentic self. This is all important to know. You keep heading down a path. Then you make a decision. Are you going to fragment further, which is where most of the population is? Okay, this is all ego stuff. Or are you going to merge back to a stitched up version of your authentic self? Meaning that you've integrated and worked through everything. And so all of this is just social conditioning. Does everybody know what I mean by that?
So the way society has it set up.
Mm-hmm. That's the trauma itself. It just keeps perpetuating this trauma in a cycle, in a cycle, in a cycle, in a cycle. We talked about before 1995, there was no internet. Then the internet came out and there was a boom of info. So then now people have a choice. They can empower themselves or not. We've talked about the old relationships and then the pendulum swing, right? Because there's always a pendulum swing to the new relationships, which is what we see now, which is why there's so much divorce and all of that. We want to be in the middle. So we want the goal, right, for all of our relationships is, and it doesn't matter what relationship it is, any relationship. The goal is team, talk, together, without judgment, without any of that, right? So all judgment comes from all this social conditioning stuff. You should be doing this, you should be doing that. And it's like, well, according to who? Who says you should be doing X, Y, Z? Okay? So when people come to me as a counselor, I put a program together for them. You know, we know that our society is stressed. There's no doubt about it. In fact, I'm going to have you guys take the stress index today. Most people have been scoring so high on this, meaning that their stress is well above what it needs to be. However, our society has set things up where it would be nearly impossible not to be highly stressed. Okay, I wasn't expecting as many people, so would one of you mind running over and asking the receptionist to make a copy of that? An additional copy? Yeah, that would be great. Thank you. So what you're looking at there is stress index. What you do with that is you read each one. If that line speaks to you in your life, you circle it, then you total the numbers, and that's your score. So up to 150 would be stress that people have in control. I rarely see that. 150 to 300 is high, can lead to some health issues. Anything above 300 is exceedingly high, and I would recommend that you get on a program like this, which is what I'm going to talk about, the layers to healing. So we're not just one body. In our Western culture, we've been led to believe that our physical body is everything. That's not the case. We actually have 4 bodies. We have the spiritual body, the emotional body, the mental body, and the physical body. In Eastern philosophies, principles, religions, they're well aware of that holistic approach to our healing. Our Western culture is not aware of that. We want to just throw things at a problem or put out little fires, right? We want to bypass a lot. So we just want to give people medication and say, okay, you're struggling with anxiety, here, let's up your dose of medication. Let's up your dose of medication. Then people come and they say, I'm not doing well. This medication isn't working. Well, if you look at this, it's because you're only targeting a very small fraction of the problem. So no, your medication isn't going to work the way that you think that it will. Now, is it part of the protocol? It can be. It doesn't have to be necessarily, but it can be, but it's not the be all and end all. It's not going to solve your issue, so to speak. So it's just one small component. So it's like rain. It starts at the top and it trickles down. So we don't even start with the physical body. We start with the spiritual body. We start with things like meditation, hypnotherapy, energy work, pineal gland activation, surrendering to higher realms and powers that aren't about religion, they're about spirituality, because religion has distorted some things. Some religions are great, and there's positive and negatives to all things. However, it has been part of the social conditioning and control structure that people need to be aware of, particularly the shame and judgment, which is what we're trying to break down. Right? We're trying to break down the shame and judgment. There is no shame to anything. There should be no judgment for anything. Thank you. Because we're all human. We're going to make mistakes. We are apt to hurt people. We can take responsibility for that in a genuine way. We don't have to shame ourselves and run away from that. Okay? So what we were just talking about are the 4 bodies to healing. There's 4 bodies to healing, not just the physical body. So in Eastern philosophies, they're well aware of this. In our Western world, we're not well aware of this. So we want to target everything from the physical, but that doesn't work. So it starts at the top, like I said, it's like rain, it trickles down. Then we work on the emotional body. We use EMDR, neuro-linguistic programming, emotional freedom technique, things like emotion code, expression, narrative therapy, talk therapy, trauma work. That's all the emotional body. Then the mental body, cognition, reading, talk therapy, classes like this, education, breaking down shame. Anything we can do to break down shame and judgment. Shame and judgment are so toxic. All judgment is self-judgment. What do you think I mean by that? It was kind of hard for me to understand that the first time I heard that about 12 years ago. All judgment is self-judgment. What do you think I mean by that?
You gotta base it off yourself. Like, they're either rich or poor, I guess, like from my standpoint. You know, they're better off or worse off.
Well, when we judge somebody, it's really stuff that we have not resolved. So I can give you an example. Let's say somebody doesn't like people asking for money on the side of the street, so they judge them. And they say, oh, they should be working, they need to get a job, what's their problem? And they're not understanding all the layers beneath that, right? Like addiction that's rooted in trauma, mental illness. So they're just judging it,
But
right?
then again, there's some of them that accept 18-year-old healthy as hell, they're just up there designing on.
Yeah, the truth is we don't know, right?
Yeah.
One of the things I mentioned in this class is a lot of times in our lives we operate from the blinds being closed. There's one blind that's cracked and open. We look in the window and we think we know what's going on, right? By just looking in that one crack. But we don't. We can only see a part of that reality, a part of that room. A lot of times it's something within ourselves that maybe our own family struggled with something and we're ashamed of it, or it's part of our past and we're ashamed of it. And so rather than addressing that shadow aspect of ourselves, we judge other people. because we want to look better. That's that narcissistic aspect to our personality. So at the very end of therapy, I wouldn't even say it's at the end, it's part of a whole program, we address the physical, but we have to address these things first, and then you start to see effects at the physical level. This is true with disease as well, physical disease. We try to target that in our culture with like chemotherapy, surgeries. If you're not doing these other things, those things will not be effective. It'll be a band-aid. So you may get some temporary relief from those things, but you will not heal those things until you address everything. So you have to address the entirety of who you are. Do you guys understand what I mean by shadow work? So here, between birth and age 7, your brain is in theta. It's the same brainwave as hypnotherapy, meaning that you're taking everything in. So every belief that your family has, every interaction, every television show, media, kids are taking in more now. That's being taken in, and that creates the fragmentation. It's like, how do I survive in this society? And so what happens is we develop a shadow aspect to our personality, meaning that all of these things that we accumulate between birth and age 7 are part of our subconscious mind. So we don't have a recollection of them or a memory necessarily. We might have fragments, but all of that is our shadow. So the shadow is merely bringing what's unconscious to the forefront. So I refer to it as like a file room. So our subconscious mind is the file room. So in a business like this, we have a file room, right? And so that's where all of our files are stored. That's kind of the makeup of our ego. And our conscious mind is the main room. And so if we want to access things from our subconscious mind, we have to go into the file room, the subconscious mind, the dark shadow, to bring up those things. So all of our judgments typically are rooted in our own social conditioning from our file room, so to speak. So when we're judging somebody, it's important to stop and say, okay, what is this judgment about for me? Why am I judging this person? Because it comes back to something in my reality, in my life, that I need to look at. Think of a time that maybe you have judged somebody. I'll give you an example of something that happened to me recently. So I have these 2 good friends that I've had for, I thought, years. And I was talking about some things that were traumatizing to me. And one of them, she and I would talk all the time. And I would always listen to her. She would listen to me. I thought we were just venting. And then one day she's like, I don't want to hear this anymore. And I was like, okay. And she's like, you talk about this too much. And I said, okay. And then she was getting more irritated because I just said, okay. And that's her judgment. Whatever it was that triggered her about something that I said about me wasn't even anything to do with her. So whatever judgment or shame was going on with her, I just allowed her to have that and say, okay, that's your thing. That's your projection. Because I was telling her about this healer I was going to, and she's like, well, I don't think you should do that. I don't trust that. And I said, okay, well, that's not asking you permission. I'm just having a conversation with you about it and talking to you about it. That would be like me telling her, I don't trust your home builder. Don't build your home, because she's having a home built. It's none of my business. She can tell me about it, right? And I can say, oh, that sounds cool. But the minute I move into judgment or shame, that's my stuff. That's my projection. And so I just said, okay, we don't need to continue this conversation then. It's not necessary. You clearly have some things that are your projection. And every time somebody projects on us, they leave an imprint. So we have to constantly be clearing that. Because our thoughts are energy. They are real things. They can do damage in the world, obviously, because that's what we see. So we have to monitor our thoughts. And then when we vocalize them and we shame people, that leaves an imprint on people. And so we have those as well. So there's ways to clear those. You know, we can use emotional freedom technique, you can use emotion code, hypnotherapy, SAGE, neuro-linguistic programming, because that's all part of our emotional energy body that you have to clear and send stuff back to people that belongs to them. It's not that you're wishing them bad, it's just that it's their stuff. So if they wished you bad and you send it back to them, it's not that you're wishing them bad, it's just that you're sending their bad intention on you back to them. Because they're responsible for that. You're not responsible for that. We're only responsible for ourselves and our thoughts and our actions. So go ahead and take a couple minutes to do this. You might be surprised by what your stress level is. Sure, is there not one there?
Oh, I didn't know.
Yeah, there's some.
Sorry, it's my first time.
Oh, that's okay.
That's fine.
There's some of that.
There's some here as well, yeah. While you're doing that, I'll talk briefly about this. We talked about this in a class. This is the shame cloud. These are all the things that our culture shames people for. So it's the root of things. Everything is rooted in shame. Shame is not real. None of the things that contribute to shame, beliefs, are real. So in our culture, we love people to be busy and successful and have titles, or we won't listen to them a lot of times. Even sometimes when they do, we won't listen to them. Even though some of their research may be very proactive and forward-moving, people won't necessarily listen because they're so rooted in their own belief system. Anger is the devil, which is so untrue. Anger is necessary. We have to be perfect and happy, love life, and love Jesus. Believe you should have all the answers. Emotions are weak, don't show them. Lots of formalized religion, guilt, fear, shame. God is punishing, which he's not. Have all these manners according to your family line, which means a lot of times that you don't share things, that you always have to be respectful, even if people aren't respectful of you. So then we project this shame, and it becomes the shame game. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. We've talked about that in prior classes. And then the blog that I recommend is the analogy of hoses, and I spoke about that last week in terms of how we process our emotions, and also the analogy of the fridge, which I'll go over briefly, with the 4 core wounds that we have, which are the trust wound, the guilt wound, the neglect wound, and the abandonment wound. A lot of times people have a hard time focusing on themselves. I know when I was a teacher and I worked at the schools for years, I'd go in right when the bell would ring and I'd leave right when the bell would ring, and I wouldn't go into the teacher's lounge for specific reasons, because most of the time those people were so nosy and they wanted to know what everybody else was doing, which is a distraction and an addiction. So when people are concerned about what other people are doing, they're typically avoiding themselves. So you see that a lot at work. So-and-so is late. If it doesn't involve you, then it may be a mere distraction and an addiction. I'll give you guys a couple minutes to total those up. If your stress is anywhere over 200, you might want to start looking at some things to manage that. Which kind of takes us into this analogy of hoses. So when our stress is very high, we're probably suppressing some things, meaning that we're not dealing with it effectively, and we're holding on tight to things that maybe we haven't expressed to people. Maybe we're holding on tight to a lot of social conditioning So the analogy of the hoses, just briefly, if you want to read it, it's on my website. 3 hoses in our society. Hose number one is what is enforced by social conditioning. It's horrific for people's health. Horrible for people's health. We are one of the sickest nations in the world, even more so than some third world countries. We have more diseases than probably anybody in the world. So more heart disease, more cancer, more stroke, now autoimmune diseases. It's all rooted in the same thing. So the first hose is, imagine that the hose is your body, right? The water is your emotions. The water is always flowing. The water never gets turned off. We're always going to have emotions as human beings. There are no negative emotions, there's just emotions. We're the ones that have labeled things as negative as part of this. But there isn't a negative emotion. They all serve a purpose. So the water is running. Our society says put a cap on it. Tighten it, tighten it, tighten it, tighten it, tighten it. And then the water doesn't have anywhere to go. So the hose bulges up because that water has to go somewhere. And it starts to crack. And eventually that crack ruptures and that water is finally out. But that hose is desecrated, which is your body, which is what disease is. Then there's the second hose that people that are a little more stubborn, usually the scapegoat, don't want to go with the flow anymore, whatever the flow is. There's a flow, and then there's a toxic flow. And the toxic flow is the social conditioning, right? So somebody pulls that cap off, water starts flying everywhere, and the hose starts going everywhere, and they just start saying whatever they want, which is healthier. I would recommend that over the first, certainly. I tend to be hose 2. I've had a lot of anger issues. People who are usually in these classes or labeled as angry are typically hose 2. They just don't want to deal with it anymore. They know something's off. They know it's uncomfortable. They have shit to say, basically. So they just take that cap off. They yank it off. Water goes everywhere. Hose 1 starts crying, oh, you're this, you're that, because hose 1 is very good at stonewalling. And they try to get you in trouble for communicating. More often than not, they don't make the association between their own autoimmune diseases or diseases and their lack of health. They still think you're the problem. There aren't as many health consequences associated with hose 2. We want to be hose 3, where you just put the hose down. But the nice thing is hose 2, you don't get desecrated because the water's coming out. It's just spraying all over the place.
Yeah.
And you're going to annoy people, and they're going to get mad at you. And
Exactly.
you might have to go to court, and you might have to go to this class, but it's not going to annihilate your body, so to speak, because you're getting it out. The goal is you have to get it out.
Yeah.
Now, hose 3 is you just lay the hose on the ground, and you let those emotions come out as they need to. So when somebody does something that you don't like, you say it in the moment. When there's a boundary that has to be set, you do it in the moment. It takes practice to get there. But I would say at this point, maybe 65-70% of our population is hose 1. Maybe 15-20% is hose 2. Those are your angry people, allegedly. And then 5-7% is healthy.